Aleem Bharwani, welcome to today's webinar. Today we have witnessed some troubling events in DC on the heels of the Georgia runoff. In many ways, some would consider that a rejection of pluralism. Today we are joined by Dr. Eboo Patel, Rhodes Scholar, PhD in Sociology of Religion, TED speaker, Obama Faith Advisory Council member, and author of the book entitled today's webinar, Acts of Faith. He's also written other great books, including Interfaith Leadership. You can buy the ebook. Support our Ismaili thought leaders. Submit your questions using the text box on the bottom right end of your screen. And to kick us off, we're going to start with a very short and very well-produced video. So Nazi, if we can hit the video, please.
We come from all over the world, carrying our history, our legacies, our stories, our ancestors and practices we've maintained for generations or created ourselves. We are orthodox and secular. We are searching and spiritual. We are black and brown and white and everything in between. We are civically minded, and when we look at what's happening in society, we think maybe we can help. We have faith in our communities, our families, ourselves, and we are inspired by our traditions to imagine an America that is different, an America that is more kind and compassionate and just. We know we can create one, especially when we come together, when we call on our crew, when we gather to work, when the many assemble as one for the betterment of all. Like those who have inspired us, they came from somewhere. They were young people, bridge builders whose visions and traditions compelled them to act. They were brave and outrageous. They did things that had not been done. They led acts of service across lines of difference. Today, interfaith leaders in communities, campuses, and in the streets across the country are engaging in conversations and actions that steer broad cultural change. And it starts with you and your story in conversation with others like you and not like you. A growing understanding of our difference and similarities that broaden our sense of who we are and who we are in connection to others. And what it means to renew the broken promises of our country. Become a bridge builder. America needs you. As Miss Brooks said, we are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond.
Become a bridge builder. America needs you. I think we can also say Canada needs you. The single global humanity needs you. That's a great video and a great initiative. Let's set the table. Tell us a bit about your story and how you founded IFYC.
Sure. Aleem Bharwani, Aleem, and to the Canadian Jamaat who's here, and a special thanks to Nazi and Alnur and the other organizers. I'm very honored to be with you today. I speak to you from my bedroom in Chicago, so thankfully I am not in the chaos and the mess that is in DC. But please keep us in your du'as. It is absolutely it is an enormously scary situation, and something that the vast majority of Americans never thought that they would see in their lives. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak about pluralism in a difficult time. There's a beautiful line by the American poet William Carlos Williams. What will they say of us in the time to come? Let them say there was a burst of fragrance from black branches. And those of us who speak of pluralism and build pluralism in a time of division, I think that we are that burst of fragrance. And I think the Jamaat has an opportunity to lead in that area. So I grew up in the western suburbs of Chicago. I have a terrific family. My parents are on this call. I'm so grateful to both of them for the house I grew up in and the example that they set. The values of Islam were always present in my house. We were not the most regular family at Jamaat Khana for a variety of reasons, but there was always the sense of you have to do service, and that service is inspired by your faith, and you have to be an ethical person, and that is inspired by your faith. And And that energy suffused my house. And as I kind of went on in my life in college, and I got involved in diversity work, and I got involved in social justice work, it became clear to me towards the end of my college career that so much good can come of people connecting deeply with their faith to make their faith a bridge of cooperation and not a barrier of division. A bridge of cooperation and not a barrier of division. And being an Ismaili and seeking to do that is actually very easy to do. Not only because the Islamic tradition and the Quran speaks so much of, to quote Surah 49 of the Quran, that God made us different peoples and tribes that we may come to know one another, but because it is such a salient theme of Maulana Hazrat Imam's discourse, of his farmans and tariqas to the Jamaat, and also of his broader speeches. And that is actually quite remarkable. There are very few religious communities on earth who have a leader who makes pluralism really a theological commitment, a command, if you will, to the extent that we are commanded by our Imam, and that is not necessarily his mode, but he sets out an inspiring vision, and he says that part of the definition of the Ismaili tariqa is a commitment to pluralism. So I begin to really deepen into that, particularly in graduate school. I did graduate school in England, and I had the great opportunity to do my PhD thesis on Ismaili religious education and how pluralism is a theme within it. And I had advisors at the Institute of Ismaili Studies like Aziz Esmail and Azim Nanji, to whom I'm enormously grateful, Shainul Jiwa, others. And I learned in some texture detail about the commitment to pluralism within the Ismaili faith. And of course, that's coupled with a commitment to service. And in so many ways, that's where my organization, IFYC, comes from, which is, can we use service as a vehicle? As you saw in that video, that's a video produced by my organization. Can we use service as a way of bringing people from different religions together to cooperate? That's the big idea. And that's kind of how my journey of being a kid who grows up in the western suburbs of Chicago, in a home suffused by the Ismaili tariqa and Islamic values, and who really deepens into that in young adulthood and decides what I want to do is found this nonprofit organization, this civic institution, if you will, that applies the value of pluralism through the vehicle of service.
So that's a great level set. That's a great level set. And so IFYC, really born in pluralism, not only a concept of pluralism, but a faith practice grounded in pluralism. Now, we hear a lot about pluralism expressed through speeches, firmans, talikas, all grounded in these modern interpretations of the Quran, as you mentioned. But what does an ideal pluralistic society look like? What does that future state look like? Can you paint a picture for us? Can you paint that vision?
Sure. So, I think the best metaphor for what pluralism looks like is a potluck. And if you think about what a potluck is it's a comfortable, safe space where people feel welcome to bring their distinctive contribution. And if people bring that contribution, then that community that gathers, right, it creates creative combinations between those various dishes. If there's things that you don't eat, you can stay away from that stuff. You meet people you might not otherwise meet. It's the contributing of distinctive contributions to kind of a feast table so that a broader community can enjoy those contributions. That's how I think of pluralism. I think of it as a potluck dinner. Now, part of what I love about a potluck, and this is so aligned with the vision of Maulana Hazrat Imam, is it's a civic space. It's a civic institution, right? What I mean by that is no general, no president, no mayor commands you to potluck. It's something that citizens do for themselves. And that so connects with kind of the vision of the AKDN to create an enabling environment for civil society, for people within a community to develop their own arts, to develop their own businesses, and to be able to contribute that to the common good. To offer something of a more political philosophy definition, a little bit of a more academic definition, at IFYC, we define pluralism as respect for different identities, relationships between diverse communities, and a commitment to a common life together, right? So three-part definition: respect for different identities, relationships between different communities, and a commitment to a common life together. And if you think to yourself, boy, that's really abstract, just imagine a potluck, right? You respect the different dishes coming in. Nobody ever says, oh, don't bring that, I hate it, right? You respect it. You might not like all of it, but you respect it. You welcome it in, right? There are all of these wonderful creative combinations that emerge. You don't want a potluck where everybody brings the same thing. That would be the most boring thing. And the most wonderful thing is when you bring your grandmother's special dip and somebody else brings their famous crusty bread, and you're like, oh, these work so well together, right? That's relationships between communities and a commitment to a common life together. You think about the kinds of things that make a potluck successful. You have to have a clean and welcoming space. You have to have a community of people who are not just feasting, but helping, right? You need people who abide by like basic decorum and rules, right? There's a common life, a common ground, a common space of a potluck, most of which we just assume. But if you think about it, if there was a set of people who didn't contribute to cleaning up, or a set of people who put their dishes anywhere and didn't really care about what how the hosts had arranged the space, that would disrupt a lot of things, right? So that commitment to a common life together, that's really important.
And I just want to zoom in on that for just a moment. So the idea of a common sense of common purpose is sometimes missing. Sometimes if you have moderates, if you have people who agree on what a sense of common purpose is, it's the beginning of like a very reasonable dialogue and mutual understanding. How do you manage those extreme edges that may not even recognize the right of that potluck to occur, who want to disrupt the potluck? How do you on that continuum of moderate in quotes to anything else, how do you begin to reconcile those differences in a broader pluralist agenda?
So that's a great question, and Aleem, you and I could go like way down the geek rabbit hole on this, right? There's all kinds of wonderful political philosophy on these kinds of things. So I'm gonna try to not be so geeky. But let me say that the great Jesuit political philosopher John Courtney Murray said that the definition of civilization is people living and talking together. That's literally the definition of civilization. Okay, and the barbarian was the one who destroyed the conversation. So it's a really beautiful thing when you think to yourself, when people live and talk together, and you have this like the image I think of is the miniatures of Akbar's court, the Mughal paintings of Akbar's court, right? And those so often are paintings of Akbar the emperor with sages from different religions. That's civilization, people living and talking together, right? And yes, there are barbarians, and we just saw a set of barbarians in Washington, D.C., right? People who want to destroy the conversation. So how do we think about this? So one of the ways I like to think about this is, what are the places in which the norms of living and talking together are so woven into the fabric of society that we just take them for granted? Let me give you an example, right? A hospital. So just reflect for a moment on how remarkable so many hospitals are. Okay, you have a Sikh doctor working with a Muslim anesthesiologist, supported by a Hindu respiratory therapist, in a room that's sanitized by a Baptist, with a Jehovah's Witness as a receptionist, run by a secular humanist who grew up Buddhist, the CEO of secular humanists who grew up Buddhist at a hospital started by a Catholic religious order. That's like every hospital in the United States and probably Canada. And there's certainly kind of an Indian and a Kenyan analog to that. So that's an excellent example of people from very different backgrounds, different ideas of salvation, different ideas of the good life, different definitions of moral, who are working together on something in common. They have a common practice, which is healing others, right? And by the way, we all know religious identity really matters at a hospital. People from different religions do different things when babies are born. They do different things when people die. In fact, different religions have different definitions of death. Different religions have very different definitions of a whole set of ethics in medicine and health, abortion being probably the biggest one. But the point that I'm making is we simply expect the diversity of a hospital to be in a state of pluralism. So what I like to do is find examples of what I call, bright spots, like hospitals. Athletic teams would be another example of a bright spot. A science lab would be an example of a bright spot, which is to say a space where people with different identities are coming together. And those different identities could lead them to vote in different ways, would lead them to believe heaven looks different, to tell different stories of creation, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a practice they are engaged in. The practice of medicine, the practice of research, the practice of baseball, whatever it is in which they are working together. And what I like to say is what if we began with those muscles, so to speak, and then sought to and ask the question, if we can do it in this space, can we do it in that space? Right? That's how I think about the kind of the muscles of pluralism. I prefer to think so there's right now America we're at a dangerous moment, right? I mean, there's some people who think this is 1968. There's other people who think it's 1859, the year before the Civil War. It's a dangerous moment, right? Genuinely dangerous, like not like not being dramatic. And I think to myself, if my car breaks down on the side of the road and I call a tow truck, and the driver of that tow truck is wearing the hat of a candidate who I abhor, do I not let that driver fix my car? Does that driver, if he saw my hat of a candidate he abhors, does he decide to not fix my car? I really hope not, right? So the point that I'm making is, if you think about that, you say there are in fact many instances in which people with different ideologies and identities do in fact cooperate because they have a practice in common. They don't have an ideal in common. They might not think they have values in common. They have a practice in common. Okay, let's do more of that, right? Let's find more of those places.
And is that muscle memory? Is that the root of IFYC, building that muscle memory? And can you tell us a little bit more about how that you make that vision of that muscle memory real? How do you activate pluralism in your world? Like, how does IFYC do that?
Thank you. That's a great question. So the big idea of IFYC is that religious diversity in the United States and Canada is amongst the least paid attention to dimensions of diversity, but amongst the most important for the functioning of a society. If you think about the contributions of the AKDN to the world, right? It principally works in Muslim majority countries, but if you think about the version of that in Canada, the United States, the contributions of Catholics to Canada and the United States, contributions of Lutherans, et cetera, a civil society cannot function without the contributions of the hospitals, the schools, the universities, et cetera, faith communities, right? So the big idea of IFYC is, can we train enough leaders to create enough spaces where people with different identities cooperate? And we work principally on universities. And one of my hopes for this Zoom or for this engagement is that there's a set of really smart Ismaili 20-year-olds on this webinar, or at least very assertive mothers and fathers of Ismaili 20-year-olds who are like, this is what my parents would do. Right? They'd be like, hey, the dude who was on the webinar, you got to listen to this, and you got to check out his organization. And when you go back to the University of Toronto or McGill or wherever, right, you're going to start an IFYC group. You're going to check out ifyc.org, and you're going to start an interfaith group, and it's going to focus on bringing the different faith and philosophical communities on your campus together in service. And you are going to figure out how to lead those projects. You're going to figure out how to run an interfaith dialogue. You're going to figure out how you ask questions so people connect their faith tradition with serving others, with cooperating across difference. That's what IFYC does. We help young people on campuses start their own interfaith group. And as you know, Aleem, because we have a little bit of a history together when you were a student at the Kennedy School, IFYC also works on the intellectual level. That's where my my series of books come from, right? Interfaith Leadership and Out of Many Faiths and Sacred Ground and Acts of Faith. And we've co-edited a bunch of books, blah, blah, blah. But we're really like making intellectual contributions to this field of pluralism, particularly the religious dimensions. And we're saying that there's this character out there called an interfaith leader, right? Just like environmentalism is built by environmentalists and human rights is built by human rights activists, pluralism, the religious dimensions, are built by interfaith leaders. And my call to you on this webinar is you ought to be an interfaith leader, especially if you're an Ismaili and your theology effectively commands it. And there's a knowledge base and a skill set associated with being an interfaith leader. You need to make a commitment. You need to decide you're going to be one, but then you got to learn some things. You got to be able to do some things well.
And just for those listening, anyone who wants to do this, who wants to reach out, you can actually reach out to me and we can help coordinate. And I'm happy to do that as well. And I'm sure they can reach out to IFYC directly as well if they'd like to do that as well. So I think a couple of different streams there as well.
Yeah, and Aleem is, and as we discussed earlier, if there's enough of a critical mass of Ismaili college students or young adults or faculty members who would like to go through an IFYC training, I'd be happy to do that and do that, in partnership with my staff who are experts in it. So, if part of what that means is if there are enough very assertive mothers and fathers of 18 to 22-year-olds on this call, on this webinar, and you can corral your kids into a 90-minute session, my staff will lead it gratis.
And I would add that I think the muscle memory that you build through these sorts of skills applies to many different parts of your professional life and work life. It makes you better as a collaborator, makes you better as an innovator, makes you better as a colleague. And I think as we look at emerging issues that are arising, whether it's anti-racism, whether it's other forms of exclusion and discrimination, these sorts of skills are assets to the workplace, independent of a strictly pure and interfaith interest. I wanted to move, we're talking about interfaith through the context of interpersonal. I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on intrapersonal. And of course, I want to make sure everyone is also, while we're sort of wrapping up this question, getting their questions into the chat box. And so we can move on to deeper audience questions as well. On the interpersonal side, in your book, you talked about meditative practices. You felt very comfortable with Ya Ali, Ya Muhammad. And it reminded me that pluralism really does start from within oneself. So when you think about these inequitable economic, political, social structures, the violence, mistrust, and interpersonal conflict that arises, these are symptoms of a physiology that's rooted deep within ourselves as individuals. And it would seem that an intrapersonal dialogue, so to speak, is a necessary precursor, a disposition required for constructive interpersonal dialogue. And so I wanted to ask you, what are some things that individuals can do? What are some practices and methods intrapersonally that you might consider or advise for as sort of like that first step towards pluralism?
Yeah. These are such great questions. Thank you, Aleem. So first of all, let me say, I'm not sure it's sequential, right? Hinduism has this kind of great typology of energies, so to speak, different spiritual energies. There's the Jnana yogi, who is the one who focuses on knowledge. There's the Bhakti yogi, who's the one who focuses on worship and the inner spiritual life. There's the Karma yogi, the one who focuses on the path of action. Like, I'm definitely a Karma yogi, probably a little bit of a Jnana yogi, and I wish I had more of the Bhakti yogi, right? So I don't think these things are sequential. I think that people have different gifts and inclinations. Having said that, I mean, I just think like the Ismaili Tariqa is just, in the guidance of Maulana Hazrat Imam, just is brilliant in cultivating the inner life, right? So bandagi, don't get me wrong, like, I wish I had the discipline. I don't, but I think it's a really wonderful thing for those who do have it. And I think that that's the kind of thing that cultivates the kind of inner life, the intrapersonal, as you're talking about, Aleem, that positions you for pluralism. I mean, part of what I think is so beautiful about the Ismaili Tariqa is we do have these like very rigorous practices like bandagi. Like, if you want to wake up at 3 in the morning and go to Jamaat Khana and meditate for an hour, you can do it. And the Imam also says, go to Jamaat Khana whenever you can, pray your dua on time whenever you can. And if you can't, bring a tasbih with you and bring it out whenever possible and say, Ya Ali, Ya Muhammad, Ya Ali. So there's this, there are standards of rigor and there's flexibility. I mean, that's just absolute genius, right? That's absolute genius. I do, and I think the tariqah under the guidance of this imam allows us to have the relationship that is right for us at the time. So I can be the kind of Ismaili who mostly is bringing out my tasbih and praying it and thinking one day I'll be a bandagi type Ismaili. I have a ton of admiration for it, a ton of respect for it. It is not a part of my life right now. I'm 45, I got 2 kids, I'm running all the time, but it is there and it is an aspiration, right? And it's all about cultivating the inner life, but there is rigor without rigidity. And I just think that it's a beautiful thing. It is one of the geniuses of the tariqah, and it's one of the geniuses of Maulana Hazrat Imam.
So I think a good bridge question was one that was emailed in, and it asks about, as I'm sort of labeling it, intra-faith dialogue. So it said, in our community, we have a rich array of traditions from the Middle East, from Central Asia, from South Asia, over which there are layers of culture, language, class, geopolitics. What is the role for intra-faith dialogue, and how does individual identity fit within these other identities under a common faith community identity?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I do think that some of the frameworks apply. So the question is like, what's the common practice, right? What are the things that these various exponents of the Ismaili tariqah would do in common? So there's a commonality around the figure of the imam. There's a commonality probably in the space of the Jamaat khana. Human beings have a tendency to go straight for the tension point, right? So I think one of the things about that is kind of a good practice of sabr or of patience is to take a step back and ask the question, okay, what do we actually do together that works? Let me ask that question. Okay, just like I said about the person from a different political ideology, if my car breaks down and I call a tow truck and he comes and he's wearing a hat of a candidate that I abhor, I still want him to fix my car. And 99.9% of the time, he still will, right? So to take that to the level of this question, when it comes to different exponents within Ismailism or Islam, what are examples of when people cooperate? And ask yourself the question, can I create another space that nurtures this kind of cooperation?
Okay, that's great. And
I mean, like, by the way, like, part of what we have as Ismailis is we have the leadership of the imam, right? So what does the imam do when the rest of us kind of discover the Tajiki Jamaat back in the late 80s and early 90s? Of course, the imam is long known that they were there. The imam encourages arts programs, right? Recognizes that Khojas, we love our Dandiya, Ras, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the Tajiks do their own arts, but arts are a common space in which people can do the potluck. They can contribute their distinctiveness, relationships can be built, there can be a sense of a common life together.
And I guess there's a question about the pluralism in the Talim curriculum, and so how can we bring out these concepts of pluralism through the Talim curriculum, especially in so much as it is a sort of a level set within this community, within our faith community. And so, do you have any ideas on how? I suspect it's more of a pedagogical question of like, how do you bring out the existing concepts of pluralism that already reside within the Talim curriculum?
Yeah, I think case studies or role plays are always powerful as a pedagogical approach. And so, if somebody were to ask you, if somebody from outside the Jamaat were to say, hey, what is it about your tradition that inspires pluralism, right? Like, talk about pluralism all the time. Tell me about your tradition that inspires pluralism. And you now have to translate. You have to take the things that you simply take for granted, right? Principally the reverence for Maulana Hazrat Imam, and you have to translate that to somebody outside of the tradition in a way that individual that it would register with that individual. Oh, I get it, you know. And now you can do that on multiple levels. Like, what if a theologian were to say, what's the Ismaili theology of pluralism versus, you know, somebody who, you know, versus somebody at a different, your taxi driver saying, tell me about what inspires you people to be involved in pluralism, right? Both of them are important questions. They need to be answered at different levels. Can you answer those questions? Can you answer them so that the other person understands? How would you do that? So in part of what my PhD was on was the Talim curriculum, and part of the genius of the Talim curriculum is active learning, right? I think this is one of the ways to do active learning is you're asking, especially older kids, tell me if you were to be asked in this situation, what inspires you Ismailis to do the work of pluralism? What would you say? How would you be convincing?
And I think it bridges to another question from the U.S., which is asking, you know, there's a complete lack of youth involvement in this interfaith space. And how do you motivate that? How do you motivate? So, you know, you know, if you have a bunch of parents on the call right now, and you know, what messaging would you help them? How would you sort of texture the ask, the motivation, the story to actually inspire action in this interfaith space?
Yeah. So I'll tell you how IFYC gets started, right? I realize when I'm 20, 21 years old that virtually all of my heroes are people of faith, and they're across faith traditions. Okay, so obviously the Imam, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Dorothy Day, Jane Addams, right? I'm kind of going down the list here. And part of what I kind of realized just kind of by happenstance one day is, wow, every single one of these people, when they begin their leadership journeys, they're young. So we all know Maulana Hazimam's 20 years old when he gets appointed. Martin Luther King Jr. is 26 years old. Gandhi is even younger when he leads the movements against the racist pass laws in South Africa. The Dalai Lama is even younger than Gandhi when he leads his people out of occupied Tibet into India. And so I start thinking to myself, boy, the idea of this range of religious traditions being connected to really powerful social justice work is very compelling to me. And what's very interesting about all these figures, the Imam, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Mandela, Jane Addams, Dorothy Day, is they all cooperate across lines of faith. They're all what I call interfaith leaders. It's not typically talked about, but look back in their histories and you will see a lot of pluralism. So I'm 2021, this is 1995, 96, and I'm really stoked by this idea. And I start to go to interfaith conferences, and they are boring. Like, fall asleep after the first session, boring. And I'm like, what in the world, right? Like, I just got done reading Martin Luther King Jr. or Dorothy Day or Jane Addams, and I'm like, my hair is on fire. And I showed up and like, there's this boring panel. What the heck? And I'm 22, 23 years old, and I would stand up from the floor and I would, you know, raise my fist and I would talk about how boring everything was. You need more young people, you need more social action, you need to be more edgy, blah, 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 blah. And somebody comes up to me at one point and was like, hey, that's a really good idea. You know, young people involved in interfaith work. You should build that. Hey, you know, it's a lot easier to be a critic than it is to be a builder. A lot harder and more important to be a builder. And when I heard that, you know, again, 22 years old, I was like, do I take myself seriously enough to try to build something? Or am I only forever going to criticize other people doing things, right? So that's really the beginnings of IFYC. There's the beating heart of the idea. Young people, social action, religious diversity, mix it all up, and interfaith work being boring. So honestly, like, a lot of it is still boring. It just is, and I don't know what to say. It just is, you know. And I don't mean it has to be a TikTok video. I mean it has to feel urgent. It has to feel like people from different religions working together build big things. That's how the civil rights movement was built, right? That's how the Underground Railroad was built. That is the founding ideal of the United States, right? For everything that the European founders get wrong, and it's legion what they get wrong. What they get right is the framework for a religiously diverse democracy. They're young men when they do it, except for Ben Franklin. Everybody else is a young man, right? So how do we make this feel like urgent? And again, I don't mean like, I mean, I'm not like a pop culture. I don't mean like it's got to feel like a sitcom, you know. I mean, it's got to feel like worthy of your best energies. And that's what we do at IFYC, right? Like I speak at 25 campuses a year. IFYC's built a network of 500 campuses, but just the idea that Martin Luther King Jr. was 26 when he leads the Montgomery bus boycott. His principal guide is Jesus, and second to Jesus is Gandhi. How unbelievable that this Black Baptist in the American South in 1955, 1956 is following the model of a Hindu from India who was assassinated a decade earlier. That's amazing. What does that look like now? That's you. That's what we tell young people at IFYC. That's you. It looks like you now. What are you going to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, you started young, right? You started young. You were interested young, and you know, in your book, you talk about this. I think it was in Azim Nanji's office where he discouraged you from taking an academic path and encouraged you to take the social innovation path. And I'm curious. You know, I think there are many young people in the Jamaat who struggle with this this idea of taking like the sure bet, that professional route, or the higher risk route, the sort of more social innovation, social enterprise route. And there's sort of the benefits of the pracademic. There's benefits of sort of straddling two worlds, but there's also benefits of benefiting from the compound interest of committing to something early and focused and just really building off of it. And I'm curious how you, in particular, balanced those and how you think about those two sort of paths. Because I think that's part of a challenge our youth face is I think they are energized by issues of importance. I don't think we always know how to take that next step, and I don't know that we're always encouraged to take that next step in a way that makes us end up as change makers.
Yeah. So you know. Thank you for that question, and I feel the sense of respect of that question. But I'm just gonna I'm 45 years old. I can tell the truth now, and you know what the truth is? There's a ton of luck involved. There is a ton of luck involved, right? Like I think to myself, if these 10 things didn't happen like randomly at the right time, I don't know. I'm trying to like put out my second religion book at, you know, some college in upstate New York, which is a perfectly good career, but I probably would not be that great at it, you know? So I think that there are some distinctive ingredients in my life, which I'm happy to share because I think that they might be surprising. So here's a distinctive ingredient. I am bad at a lot of things. You know what that means? It means that a lot of paths are closed to me. I'm a bad tester. I wouldn't have gotten into Yale Law School if I tried, even though I'm a Rhodes Scholar, right? I just don't do. I don't stink. I'm not terrible, but I'm not elite, right? I am really bad at math. I got a 64.7% in pre-calculus my junior year of high school. I tearfully begged my teacher for a C. He gave it to me. That's the last math class I ever took. I can't do things in math. So what am I saying? I'm saying a part of the beauty of my life is I don't have 50 elite paths open to me. You know, there's all these like talented kids who I feel terrible for because they have the anxiety of choice. I didn't have, you know, like there's only a couple things that I do, you know, do well. And that's not false modesty. Like it's totally true. It's totally true. It happens to be, and my wife tells my kids this all the time, as I'm like, you know, for the 9 millionth time trying to figure out which switch turns on which light in the living room, right? I can never remember. My wife will look at my kids and be like, your dad is not good at that many things, but the handful of things he's good at, he is really good at, right? So it just so happens that I got so lucky that the 3 or 4 or 5 things that I happen to be pretty good at align with the substantive work that I want to do, which is kind of be Johnny Pluralism seed, starting an organization, doing the strategy for the organization, telling a story. Happens to be that my set of talents coincide with my set of interests, and that I got really lucky. I met Azeem Nanji at the right time. I worked in IFYC for 4 years. I asked 1,000 people for money to get the organization started. I was literally thinking in June of 2002, boy, I need to really get myself a real job, because this IFYC thing is just not happening. And then I get a phone call from, believe it or not, an Ismaili at the Ford Foundation, Zara Qasim. Hey, I'm trying to get you $35,000. What could you do with it? I'm like, I could eat. That's what I could do, because I haven't eaten for a minute, But if that phone call hadn't come, the point that I'm making is like, there's a lot of this that I think to myself, boy, I worked really hard. Boy, I had the right idea at the right time. And there's just a ton of it that's luck. Okay. So if I'm on a college campus and there's an Ismaili kid, 20 years old, asking me a question, she's always like, how'd your parents let you do it? And here's the answer. I got really good grades. And so my dad's on this right now. My mom might be on this, or she might be on a dua call, which she takes at 7:25. But I bought my freedom with good grades, right? And what I mean by that is my parents were wonderful enough, and I think kind of savvy enough to be like, look, we get that you're kind of an off the beaten path kind of guy. Do really well in school, go off the beaten path, and if that doesn't work out, you can always get back on the beaten path. You can always apply to law school if this IFYC thing doesn't work out, right? And so I got really good grades, right? And I didn't take math after my junior year in high school. I figured that much out. But that's kind of the secret. And the secret is an unbelievable amount of luck, the right people at the right time, and there's some stick-to-itiveness. There's some right idea at the right time. There's an awful lot of pit bull in me, There's a big brown guy in America chip on my shoulder in me, and an awful lot of luck.
An audience member wrote in and they cited a passage in your book. I realized that I loved Sanskrit prayer, that I considered it beautiful, even holy, but it wasn't my holy language, not my way of connecting with God. And I understood somewhere in my soul that ultimately I needed to be with someone who shared the same language of prayer. So I've seen literature that it says it's easier to communicate emotions in your mother tongue, while technical professional communication is easier to sort of pick up in second languages. So in this passage, is this a reference to sort of the neurolinguistics of sort of interaction and communicating about difficult, sort of more emotional concepts? Is this more of a spiritual reference or a combination? And I guess the root of the question I'm sensing is there a spiritual role in relationships? Is there a relationship role in spiritual search?
So there's definitely nothing neurolinguistic about it, because I never heard that word in my life, and I feel an awful lot smarter. And that's what it's like to roll with the Canadian Jamaat, because then you hear new words, right? People actually read the book, which I appreciate. And then they teach you new words. So no, I was not thinking neurolinguistics, but I appreciate the contribution to my vocabulary. What I was referencing was when I was in grad school, I had a close friend who was a Hindu, and she would do Sanskrit prayer before every meal, and she was part of a Hindu community that taught a spiritual practice that I took the session, right? No interest in converting or anything. It just learn a new kind of meditation practice. And I found Sanskrit prayer and chanting beautiful. I find Hebrew beautiful. I find Latin beautiful, right? I find the language, I find the Bible, I find all these things beautiful. I find them holy, and they are not home. And part of it, what I mean, they're not my language. And I wanted to deepen into my language of prayer, and I wanted to find a life partner who would share that, and I did. My parents-in-law, I think, are on this webinar, and I found the best. I'm the luckiest man in the world. Right? I talked about luck earlier. The luckiest thing that ever happened to me was I ran into Shanaz Mansouri when I was 27 years old, and I convinced her to marry me. And to be with somebody who you share a language of prayer with is really important. And by the way, she's a Sunni Muslim, and I fully respect Ismailis who decide that their language of prayer is so specific they want to be with other Ismailis. I totally get that. For me, it was the larger space was the most important thing, which is to share the language of prayer, of Arabic prayer, of Quranic prayer. We actually, our prayer practice in my house is dua. We pray dua together. I pray, my kids pray, and that is our common practice. But I wanted. It's my language of prayer. I am not making a statement that it is objectively the most important language of prayer, right? I'm saying it has a fullness that it is the banquet and it is the fullness for my life, and that's the space that I want it to be in. And part of what you'll hear Maulana Hazar Imam say about pluralism is things like, there's nothing to be gained in arguing with other people about the legitimacy of their interpretation or tradition. Nothing to be gained by that. So why do that, right? Like, you have every right to adhere to your own interpretation of the fullness and the feast. Do that. Don't judge other people's, right? My thing is like, all this is beautiful. All this is beautiful. I appreciate the beauty. I have my own, and I want to. When I come home and do my prayers, I want to do them in my language.
Questions come in. Are there specific insights from your work that can help us add nuance to how we engage with pluralism within the tariqa, within the tariqa? There's subsets here. So within the tariqa, within the ummah, with people of other faiths, both mono and polytheistic, and finally with atheists or agnostics who don't necessarily identify with a specific faith practice.
Yeah. So I'll go back to the thing that I've said a number of times, but let me put this in something of an academic frame. I'm a strong believer in the sociology of pluralism, first and foremost, right? Most people, I'll share a line that somebody shared with me that I think is a great line. I might have to sneeze here in a second, so just a warning. I'll take my headphones off when I do that, but just a warning. I might have to do that quickly. Excuse me.
We'll allow it. So remember, you can add your questions to the chat box and get as many as we can.
So the question that I would ask is, what do we already do together that fulfills the definition of pluralism, in which our identities are respected, in which there are positive relations between different communities, and in which there is some kind of a common life together? If you work together in a hospital with people from diverse identities, that is an exceptional example, right? You do not, the point that I'm making is, do not begin with the question, how do we untangle the deepest theological difference that we have? Why would you start with the hardest thing, right? But part of what I am encouraging is you have to have the eyes to look for the thing that you already do in common, not just that you have in common, but that you do in common. And you engage and say, look, if we can be doctors together in this hospital, if we can be athletes together on this team, if we can be partners together in this science lab, why can't we do other things together, right? I know that when we're athletes on this team together and you need to say your prayers, I create a space for that. I'm respectful of your identity. And you know that I don't eat pork, and so you don't order pork for after team meals, right? It's a great example of how we're respectful of our diverse identities. We have relationships with each other, and we're engaged in a common practice. So So what I'm encouraging, right, is the first thing to do is pay attention to the spaces in which we already engage positively. Ask the question, how do I create more of those spaces? And then you have to have a skill set to be able to do that. And part of what I'm doing is I'm also engaging in narrative, right? Like I am telling the story of hospitals as cathedrals of pluralism. You see what I'm saying? I'm telling the story of hospitals as the cathedral. The hospital does what it does. I am narrating the story in a particular way. It is a fact on the ground whose story can be told in a variety of ways. I am telling it as the story of pluralism. And I'm saying to you, everywhere you look is the story of pluralism. Be able to pay attention to it, be able to narrate it, be able to point it out to other people, ask yourself the question, what does it look like to create more spaces where this exists?
It reminds me of, like, I think Hajiram talks about islands of stability. And I think it's sort of the similar notion. You start with islands, expand those islands, secure those islands. A question from one of our all-wise is, how can pluralism, evangelical traditions, or Dawa traditions seeking to convert coexist?
So it's a great question, and the answer is they just do, right? And here's what I mean by that, right? Sociologically, if the evangelical Christian who seeks to convert you, when he needs an accountant and he comes to you, or he needs a doctor and he comes to you, or he needs a physical therapist and he comes to you, he is coming to you in a very different setting, and you're engaged in a different thing. The point that I'm making is the evangelical Christian is not always trying to convert you. And you are, if you are a Dawa inclined Ismaili, are not always trying to convert somebody else. You are also in spaces in which you're cooperating, right? So in a very practical way, again, to focus on the sociology of this, there are spaces in which there are spaces that encourage positive cooperation. Pay attention to those spaces. Ask what the secret sauce is there. What are the ingredients that go into that? Point those spaces out to people, right? And recognize, I think this is the distinctive thing I'm going to say on this question. There is a theology, I say this to my evangelical Christian friends. Actually, I got this from an evangelical Christian friend. I repeat it to other evangelical Christians. There is in the Bible a theology of the Great Commission, which is to say a theology of evangelizing to others. There is also a theology of the Great Cooperation, which is to say a theology of the holiness of cooperating across lines of difference. The Good Samaritan story in the New Testament is the signal example of cooperating across lines of difference. Everybody knows the Good Samaritan story, right? Man is left. This is probably the most commonly known story from the New Testament, inspires Christians far and wide for centuries. I'll retell it briefly as an interfaith story. Man is left for dead by the side of the road after being robbed, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Two people pass him by, a priest and a Levite, leaders in his own religious community. Okay, they pass him by. They think he's unclean. They don't stop and help. Somebody does stop and help. Somebody who's a Samaritan, part of a different tribe, the Samaritan tribe. He dresses the man's wounds. He puts the man on his donkey, brings the man to an inn, stays with him for 2 nights, seeks to nurse him back to health, gives the innkeeper extra money, and says, keep this man for as long as it takes to bring him back to health. If you require more money, I'll bring it to you, right? Jesus in this famous parable says, this is the Good Samaritan, go and do likewise. Well, who's the Samaritan? It is typically translated, your Christian friends will say that the Samaritan is the other, and the story is about sometimes you follow the morality of, sometimes the morality of the other is superior to the morality of your own. Remember, it's the priest and the Levite who passed the man by, right? But if you dig a little bit deeper into the story, what kind of other is the Samaritan? The Samaritan is a religious other. The Samaritan is from a different religion. The Samaritans prayed to a different God. The Samaritans prayed at a different temple. So what is Jesus saying here? That the morally superior person, whose example you are supposed to follow, for whom your eternal existence depends. That's how the story begins. How will I attain eternal existence? Is how the story begins. Your eternal existence depends on following the morally superior path of the religiously different person. That's the theology of interfaith cooperation in Christianity. And part of what I remind my evangelical Christian friends is, you can absolutely try to convert me. Good luck, right? But you should also try to cooperate with me, because that is also part of the Christian faith. And I think that's the case in the Ismaili tariqah also. Now, let's be honest, right? Dawah has been de-emphasized in our tradition, in our tariqah. We don't have like a super assertive dawah operation anymore. But we're probably not as proactively cooperative as we could be. We have a theology of cooperation, principally that comes from the Imam. An interesting question to ask is do our Jamaats have a sociology of interfaith cooperation that is worthy of the theology of interfaith cooperation? I'm going to say that again because that's some big stuff, right? Do we, as a Jamaat, have a practice of interfaith cooperation that is worthy of our theology of interfaith cooperation? Are we living up to the ideals, basically?
I think we've got time for one more here. Have you done interfaith dialogues in workspaces? And how is that different from work done on campuses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, the funny thing you say that is IFYC is like beginning a consulting practice and a training and education practice around interfaith cooperation in private companies. We're just launching that this year. In fact, I just talked to senior people at Salesforce yesterday. We're submitting a proposal to Walmart. So we're moving into that. And I mean, I'll leave you with this example, and forgive me for going deep into this rabbit hole. This is the kind of new focus of my organization, and so I'm spending a lot of time thinking about this. Here's what we're saying to private companies, right? We're saying, here's who you don't want to be. You don't want to be Abercrombie and Fitch circa 2015. A young Muslim woman, Samantha Al-Hoof, walks into an Abercrombie and Fitch. She's wearing a headscarf. She doesn't get hired because her headscarf doesn't abide by Abercrombie's look policy. She sues, takes the case to court. Remember, this is the United States, First Amendment. She wins 8-1. Scalia writes the majority opinion. Scalia's opinion says it was incumbent upon Abercrombie to know that it was an article of religious dress and therefore falls under federal anti-discrimination statute. So your company, the Supreme Court is saying, your company is required to have enough religious literacy to know when a scarf on a woman's head is probably religious in nature. You don't want to be that company. Here's who you do want to be, right? Martha Moore, who's a vice president of Nike, is at the beach, she's at the pool, she keeps on noticing, how come Muslim women aren't getting in the pool? And then it clicks for her. Nobody makes bathing suits that abide by the standards of modesty that many Muslim women adhere to. Well, good thing she worked for a sportswear company, right? Because Martha Moore's like, I'm going to drive a truck through this opportunity. And she designs what's called victory wear. Look it up, right? Look up Nike Muslim wear or Nike victory wear. And she basically decides this is a potential market of hundreds of millions, at least tens of millions of women who are not being served, who can't go in the beach and the pool safely. Okay, well, I'm going to meet that. I'm going to serve that market, and I'm going to build social inclusiveness along the way, right? So part of what we're saying to companies is, this is not just about having a diverse employee base, although that matters. This is about like recognizing the beautiful, wonderful diversity of the world and recognizing that the products and services of your company, if you are aware of that religious diversity, which many companies are not aware of, how that awareness, whether you're in hospitality or you're in food or you're in clothing or you're in retail or whatever, how that awareness can help you do your job better, right? Build your business. So that's the area we're getting into at IFYC. And notice that we are anchoring this in the reason that companies exist, which is to build their business, right? We're not principally anchoring this in employee satisfaction, although that's super important. I think there ought to be foot baths in companies so that, the Muslims who need them can use them for prayer. I absolutely think that's the case. But a company is in existence to advance its products and services. And I think for a diversity effort to be really serious, it has to live there. So that's what we're up to now.
That's wonderful and sounds like a great future direction. That brings us to time. I want to thank the Council for Canada for organizing this. I want to thank the Continental Jamaat for your questions. And most of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Patel, for taking the second hour with our Jamaat about IFYC, which of course stands for Interfaith Youth Council. We are proud of you. Or court, sorry.
That's all right. That's all right.
We are proud of you. We're cheering for you. And we appreciate your role modeling, pluralism, scholarship, innovation. We wish you, your family, your country, health, peace, and prosperity. Thank you, and Khudafis.
Khudafis. Thank you to everybody. I'm proud to be with you tonight. Deeply appreciative of being an Ismaili Muslim. Deeply appreciative of the Jamaat. Thank you so much.